So I'm sure many of you have had the same issue as I have with Blender's automatic weight painting. It's a fantastic tool, it's great, but it's really not always perfect, especially with automatically weighting objects that either have overlapping faces or different pieces or just really dense meshes. But don't worry, there are two possible solutions to kind of get you over this hurdle, especially if you're a beginner at rigging. The first solution is using a mesh deform modifier. The second solution is the data transfer modifier. I'm going to be going over both of those in this tutorial so that we can get your weight painting looking a bit more like this as opposed to this. So I already have a file set up with a basic pair of pants I've modeled here without very much thought, and especially here you can see the pants pockets are disconnected from the mesh, which in this case, if we look at the pose mode for the automatic weight painting, the pocket doesn't really follow it at all. And I also gave it an interior for the pants, so the pants mesh is actually two-sided, which also causes problems because now with our bad weighting, the mesh inside bleeds outside of the actual outside of the mesh. And I see this problem happen a lot with Marvelous Designer meshes, especially if people have something that they've already laid onto a model in Marvelous and are trying to get it weighted. Now all of a sudden it just won't weight anything properly. So the first solution here is the mesh deform modifier. Now I've already made what is called a cage mesh for this, which is basically just a dummy mesh that holds the basic shape of the object that we want to deform here. So if I go to change the viewport display of this, we can see that in solid view, and get out of rendered view for a second, it's just kind of a blob that covers our object, but it does make sure to maintain the important parts of the form, like where the legs actually start to separate, because what this does is acts as a lattice deformer for our mesh that has the modifier on it, and that will make a bit more sense in a second if you're not familiar with lattices. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to take this dummy mesh, which also should have pretty even topology for it to work as best as possible. It doesn't have to, obviously, there's no rules, but it typically works better that way. So I'm just going to take that, and this I'll actually just automatically weight paint by pressing Control P and armature deform with automatic weights. And we can double check here, go into pose mode, hit Control Tab, and we'll just move the foot around, and that looks like it's deforming kind of how we'd want it. Definitely a lot better than the original. And we're gonna go back out and select our pants, go to the modifier tab, and we're gonna add a mesh deform modifier. And we'll pick our object as the cube here, and we'll actually name this deformer, just to make things a bit clearer. And in the mesh deform modifier here, you want to make sure you click bind. And now this mesh is bound to the kind of overall shape of the cage mesh. So if I move a vertex here, you can see it starts to pull at it. Now, an important thing to note is that when you have a mesh deform modifier, all of the pieces of your mesh that is being deformed or has the modifier on it needs to be inside of this cage mesh. Otherwise, it won't bind and it won't work because it's only looking at vertices that are inside of the deform object. But now we have our dummy mesh, which is kind of interpreting the weighting and deforming our inside pants here that actually are deformed. And if we go here, we see that I actually did exactly what I was talking about, where things are not quite in the right spot. And normally I would cut this out, but I think I'm going to leave it in just so you can have a better understanding of how to solve these problems if they arise. So I'm going to go back to the dummy mesh. I'm going to set it to viewport display back to solid, and it looks like, yeah, it's poking out just a tiny bit here, and we don't want that. So I'm gonna take our dummy mesh here, and I'll do this for both sides since it should be mirrored. You can use the mirror modifier, whatever works best for you. I'm just gonna proportional edit this out a little bit, just so we no longer have that part that's sticking out. And then we're gonna go back, we'll go into wireframe, actually here, display as wire again. And we wanna take this modifier off because it's gonna try and tug at the deform again. And we're gonna try and reapply this modifier. Mesh deform, object, deformer, and hit bind. Now everything is bound, and let's see how this works. And it's perfect. So again, very important that everything stays within the bounds of the cage mesh. Otherwise, it just doesn't bind and it doesn't work. This is a good solution. However, sometimes it can get a little heavy on the processing side, especially if you have a very, very dense mesh, because it's trying to calculate the deform of this thing from the armature, and then it's trying to pass that along through into a mesh deform onto your original object. So there's pros and cons to this method. It's a little more accurate just because you're not having anything directly weighted. It's just guessing basically, and deforming the space around the object, but it's not always perfect. So our other solution here is to do what we already did, attaching a dummy object to the rig, but instead of using it as a deformer, we're gonna take the weights associated with that and transfer them onto the new geometry. And that's gonna be using the data transfer modifier, which basically just takes whatever object data and transfers it to the current object, usually by proximity. So if this vertex is closest, I'm gonna take that vertex, or kind of sample the ones that are close. So you're gonna start with your original object, and there's a couple of ways to do this. I'm just gonna go through the easiest way that I think of for doing this, because essentially the weird part about this process is the remeshing, because we're gonna wanna make a little more accurate of a dummy object to get these weights on. So I actually have a duplicate here called pant remesh, and I'm gonna go in here, and first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna select these loops on the interior, and I'm just gonna hit V so that it separates those edge loops into their own thing. And now this interior piece, if I hit select anything in here and hit Control L, it is going to now select everything in here that's connected, but now they're not connected anymore because we already ripped them apart. And I'm just gonna delete that so our remesh modifier doesn't get confused when we have interior faces. And I'm also going to select everything, hit M, merge by distance, and I'm gonna bring this distance way up. And I'm hoping that this kind of smashes the pant pocket into our original mesh, but it may or may not work. So we'll see. And then you're just gonna go to add modifier, hit remesh. This is where things get a little messier. The remesh modifier doesn't do great with what's called non-manifold geometry, and non-manifold geometry is just something that isn't a fully enclosed watertight surface. So our pants have faces that are on top of other faces, especially where the pocket meets the pants, and it's not perfect, so it doesn't really know what to interpret as the inside and the outside of the mesh. So you can kind of scroll through here and use the different remesh properties, or not properties, types, and it looks like Smooth is actually doing a rather good job compared to Voxel, which doesn't really know where the inside of our mesh actually is. So I'm gonna go to Voxel, or not Voxel, Smooth, and up the octree depth until we get something that's a little smoother. So I'm gonna up this one more by 8, but you don't have to if that's a little too much processing power. Then we're gonna apply that modifier. So now we have our remesh, and if we unhide this, we have our pants data. And we're gonna take the pant remesh and we're gonna automatically weight that. All right, now our remesh pants are weighted, and let's check on that. Control tab to go in pose mode, and we've got some smooth deformations going on. It's a little funky here. So I think what we're gonna do is we can go into weight paint, and on those vertex groups, this is just the basic Rigify vertex groups, we have some pretty sharp edges, it looks like. No, we don't. Again, I'm gonna leave this in because I wanna make sure people can see the errors and then understand, oh, I ran into that. I understand how to fix this problem now, because there's a lot of things that don't go over that. I think what I'm gonna do is, it looks okay-ish, since this is much denser geometry and we're going on to lower density geometry, it might kind of just blur out. So I'm gonna try that first. If not, you can go into weight painting and manually blur it yourself a little more, but I think this should work. So I'm going to unhide our pants here. If we go to data transfer, pants data, honestly, I'll hide the rig right now, and I'll hide pants remesh as well. And on pants data, the original pair of pants, I'm going to add a modifier, and it's over here, very top left, and modify data transfer. So we're gonna click our source, pants remesh, and you wanna tick this drop down here that says vertex data, and we wanna click vertex groups, because we wanna take the vertex groups of the pants remesh object, which in this case contains all the bone weighting data, and we want to pull that out and transfer it, in this case mapped by nearest vertex. Now there's a bunch of options here. I just use nearest vertex. Maybe there's a better way, but that's what I use. Hit generate data layers and then hit apply. And now we'll unhide our rig, and all you need to do is, we have the vertex data in here now, or the vertex group data, and we can just shift click our rig, Control P, and empty groups. And all that's gonna do is it's gonna use the existing vertex groups, and it's going to assume that, okay, this is probably mapping to the bone that it's named after, and kind of goes from there. And now we can check if our weighting worked out. And it did. Look at that. I really hope this was helpful, because I know a lot of people were asking me for help on rigging things, especially when things get a little weird with Blender's automatic weighting system. I hope to do more tutorials in the future. Next one I'm probably going to do is adding lighting in the compositor by using normal pass, which I will go way more in depth on in that video. So please subscribe if you think I did a good job here, and I will hopefully see you in the next video. Thank you.